Today I want to talk to you about drawing hair with graphite pencils. This is something that I think seems quite complicated. It seems very difficult, like there's an awful lot of detail, but actually it's a process that I really enjoy. I always follow the same steps. So today I'm going to talk you through the steps that I use and show you everything you'll need to know to draw hair. Now before we go into the process, let's first off talk about how to use the pencil. Now throughout this I'm going to talk a lot about flicking motions. This is where I gently brush my pencil against the paper to make these very soft hair-like flicks. Now this is used throughout drawing the hair and it's something that is definitely worth practicing. You don't want to accidentally make some really hard thick marks. You want to make sure that you're really light with the pencil, and this will be 10 times easier if you have a sharp pencil. Now it's actually not only flicking motions that we're going to need to use for drawing hair, we'll also need to use circular motions, although not as much. This is where I'm trying to block in some colour. I'm trying to get down the pencil as smooth as possible, and I just very lightly make these circular motions, gradually building up the graphite. So those are the two main kind of motions that I'm going to talk about in this video. Let's take a minute to think about the general kind of method for drawing the hair. So when you're drawing something like this, you don't want to be trying to draw each individual hair. That would take you ages and be really hard. What you want to do is split the hair into sections. So you can see for this lady's hair here, if I split it into sections, I want to draw each of these areas separately. So within each area, I don't worry about drawing all of the perfect individual hairs. What I do focus on is getting all of the hairs going in the right directions and getting the lights and darks in the right place in each of these sections. And that all together will build up the hair. So the only other thing to think about before you get started is the materials that you'll need. So generally speaking, I use 3 graphite pencils for drawing hair. I use a hard pencil, so maybe something like an HB if I'm using sort of standard graphite, or here I'm going to be using matte graphite pencils and I'm going to use a 4B. And then I'll use a kind of medium middle ground pencil, maybe like a 3B in usual graphite, and then a really soft pencil, so a pencil that's going to come over really dark, like a 6B, or in the matte graphite I'll be using a 12B. So beyond these 3 pencils, I'll also be drawing this on Bristol board paper, and the main material that I need beyond that is some erasers. So I'm particularly thinking about an electric eraser, and you'll see a little bit later what we use this for, but I do think it's well worth investing in one. And I also do use a putty eraser as well. So that's the main materials you'll need. Now before we get started, if you would like to draw this hair with me, it is available on my Patreon. On my Patreon I have loads of tutorials both in graphite pencil and in colour pencil, and I cover loads of different subjects. I do like to have a lot of variety in what I draw. Now every tutorial on here includes full in-depth instructions, the real-time footage, a list of all of the materials that I'll be using, sketch outlines, and of course the reference photo. And I do a mixture of reasonably fast drawings, what I call quick wins. So drawings that I try to keep down to about 3 hours. And then I've got some much longer, bigger, but more impressive drawings that do take a lot longer. Do check out the link in the description. Alright, so we've covered all of the basics. Let's start drawing this lady's hair. So starting here with my hardest pencil, so the lightest pencil I'll be using in this drawing. And I'm just going to work through one section at a time. What I want to be doing here is getting everything mapped out. It doesn't need to be perfect, but I do want to be trying to get my bearings. I want to be trying to get the hair mapped out, all going in the correct direction. And just generally get the very rough lights and darks marked in. So I'm starting on this section at the top, and you'll see I'm using those very light flicking motions. I want to begin to be building up the texture. So just very lightly flicking my pencil against the paper with that really nice sharp pencil. Now there are some areas that I do want to make a little bit darker, but what I don't want to do is be pressing really hard on these areas. I want to still press nice and lightly, but add more flicks of the pencil into those areas to build up more of the hair and build up the darker hair rather than pressing hard. Now I do find, particularly to begin with, everything looks a little bit scratchy, but don't worry about that. We will soften everything out in a little while. So I'm I'm just working my way around the head. And honestly, the most important thing here is getting the direction of the hair correct. Now, I did already take the time before I started to put down a really rough sketch of all of those sections I showed you a little bit earlier. So I do know roughly what needs to go where, but I'm going to get a lot better idea for it once I've mapped all of this out. So once I've filled in all of the sections on the left-hand side, I can then move on to the right-hand side. Still working my way over, working in these flicking motions, putting more flicking motions where I want it to be a bit darker, and putting fewer flicking motions where I want it to be a bit lighter. And I do think quite quickly you end up with something that does look like hair. It's amazing how quickly it can come together. Now, one of the main reasons that I like to work this way, not only because working from the hardest pencil towards the softest pencil and building up the layers creates a much nicer, richer color, but also I find it's very forgiving because I can get a good idea of what the hair is looking like at this point. If I think I need to add in a few more flicks of the pencil, so for example here I think her hairline needs to come down a little bit lower, I can add that in. It's quite easy to see that at this point. And in fact, there's plenty of opportunities for me to adjust things as the process goes on. So once I've gone through and filled in the hair on the top of the head, I would say I'm generally speaking at this point reasonably happy with how the hair looks. But what I want to do before I move on is make some of the darker areas darker. I've made them a little bit darker by going over the areas more times, adding more flicking motions to the darker areas, but I think I can make that a bit more obvious. I think I can make it a bit softer as well. So here you can see I'm using those circular motions. I'm just very lightly going over any area that I want to be a bit darker. So generally speaking, this is around the lady's roots. It's generally a little bit shadowed around here where the hair kind of goes in. And you can see I'm just working in these small circular motions to make the whole area look a little bit darker. I'm still pressing very, very lightly here. That is very important. And I'm not worrying about losing any of the flicking motions that I've been building up. They are still visible even when I'm going over here with these circular motions. And you can see what a big difference it makes going back over these darker areas with the circular motions. It's just adding so much more definition to the hair. So once I'm happy that I've filled in and gone over all of those darkest areas, at this point, I want to think about blending. And when I blend, I don't use a blending stump. What I like to do is use a piece of tissue. And all I do is wrap the piece of tissue around my finger like this. And then I can gently brush my finger against the paper. So I want to be doing this in the direction of the hair. And you'll see that it's just smoothing out what I've got here. You can still see all of those flicks that I made, but they are a lot softer. And it's just generally creating a really nice base for me to build all of the hair on. Now, don't worry too much if you accidentally blend into the area around the outside of the hair, because we can tidy that up in a little while. You just want to lightly flick over the whole of the hair, smoothing all of it out. Now, you can see what big difference it makes, particularly if you look at the hair on top of her head in comparison to the hair in the bun. The hair in the bun looks a lot scratchier. So now let's do exactly the same thing, but with a slightly softer pencil. So for this, I'm working with the matte graphite pencils, and I'm using an 8B pencil here. But if you were using kind of standard graphite, I would use something like a 3B. And I'm doing exactly the same thing as I did before. I'm once again working my way over the hair in these flicking motions. Once again, following the direction of the hair, going over the darker areas more times with the flicks and going over the lighter hairs less times. Now, it really is a case of doing exactly the same thing as before. And I do think it's much easier now because everything is already marked out. So we can kind of get an idea of what needs to go where. Now, I am having a really good look at my reference photo as I go here, really thinking about if there's any areas that slightly need adjusting. So for example, if I think maybe the hair's going in slightly the wrong direction, I can adjust that now. Or if I want to change her hairline like we did before, for example, or generally change the shape of a clump of hair, now is a good time to do that. But you'll see it looks very similar to what we did before. It is looking a little bit scratchy again, but that's okay. But on the most part, it's looking very, very similar, just a little bit darker. So as always, what I do to one side, I want to do the same to the other, and I'll also do the same on the bun. And then once I'm happy with how the hair's looking, I want to do, again, exactly the same thing with the circular motions. I once again want to be using these circular motions to make some of the areas that need to be a bit darker, making them that extra bit darker. So once again, going over the hair around the parting around here, just nice and lightly with a sharp pencil, and just generally adjusting anything I need to. And you can see how quickly this is looking a lot better. So once I'm happy with all of the shading, I want to once again do exactly the same thing with blending. I want to again be using the same piece of tissue to be working in the direction of the hair and just smoothing everything out. It's making the whole hair look much softer, much smoother, and will make building the next layer a lot easier. So now let's move on to the softest pencil I'll be using in this drawing. This for the matte graphite is the 12B, but if I was doing this with kind of usual graphite, I would do it with the 6B. And I'm once again doing the same thing. Now I would say here I'm focusing a little bit more on those darkest areas. I am still adding some light flicks on the lighter areas, but my main focus is on the deeper areas of shadow. Because this is a softer pencil, it does make the darkest values, and I really want to be trying to work with that. So once again, if I want to be building up a darker area, I don't want to be pressing harder, I want to be adding more flicks with my pencil. You can see this area here is especially dark, but as tempting as it is, don't press harder to create that. Just keep adding these flicking motions until it's as dark as you need it to be. And I'm again working around the head, looking at these darkest areas. And I have to say, even at this point, it's looking reasonably realistic. It's looking reasonably like realistic hair. I can be working very lightly around the edge of the hairline here, just to create some of these very small baby hairs. And it generally, I think, helps the hair blend a little bit better with the face. And then again, once I've gone over the whole area with all of the flicking motions, I want to go back to the circular motions and really build up those darkest values. The key here to it looking realistic, or one of the keys, is contrast. So once I'm happy with all of these darkest areas, I once again want to blend. Still nice and lightly, still with a tissue. Don't worry if the lights get a little bit lost, we can always add those back in a minute, sort of some of the lighter areas of the hair. So now we've got all three pencils all marked in, all of the hair very clearly marked out. I now want to start adding in those lightest areas and adding in a lot of the baby hairs. So the first thing I'm doing here is using a putty eraser just to tidy up around the edge. Where I blended with the tissue, quite a few areas have got a little bit smudged, so I can just tidy that up. And then I also want, whilst I've got this putty eraser, to add a few light shines back into the hair. There are a few parts of the hair that need to be lighter than what they are at the moment. So you can see me molding the eraser into a flat shape, and I can just lightly brush the eraser against the hair to add any lighter areas back in. Now it's reasonably subtle, I don't want it to be too sort of stark in its contrast, but it's just giving that hair a little bit of extra sort of shine. Now I actually don't need to add a huge amount of this in, just a small amount, particularly on the left hand side, because that is where the light is coming from in the reference. And then once I'm happy with all of the areas from the putty eraser, I'm happy that I've got all of these more subtle light areas in. I want to start working with my electric eraser. Now what I'm going to use this for is adding in a lot of the kind of light baby hairs that you can see going over the top of the hair. So I can just press the button and let it lightly remove some small amounts of pencil. And you can see it's reasonably subtle, but I honestly do think that this is the key to it looking realistic. Now I am following the baby hairs that I can see on the reference. Not necessarily perfect, but I am striving to, because I do think it looks more realistic if you follow that. The baby hairs tend to go in a very random way, and I think it's difficult to be that random without using something like a reference photo to help you. Now, a lot of the baby hairs as I'm going through here are looking actually reasonably bright. So once I've gone over the whole head and I'm happy with the baby hairs I've added in, I actually don't want them to look quite as bright as what they are at the moment. So I can just go back over the hair one last time, very lightly with a clean piece of tissue now, give it a really light blend, and you can see that that just tones down these baby hairs. You can still see them, but they're not quite as bright. Now, most of the hairs I think need to be a bit more subtle like they're looking now, but there is the odd hair that does need to be quite bright white. So once I've blended, I can then go back over the hair and just add in any hairs that do need to be bright white. So now at this point, 90% of the hair has been drawn. What I now want to do is add in the final details. So I'm going back to my softest pencil and I'm going mostly around the edge of the hair, adding in all of the little baby flyaway hairs around here as well. Now I'm once again following the reference photo where I can to try and get them to look as natural as possible, and just adding some very light little flicks the whole way around the edge. So after that, I just want to add in some last very few final details, and that is it. So all I do is work my way through the pencils from hardest to softest, building up the hair in sections using flicking motions and using circular motions to add in those darkest areas. And I always make sure to blend with the tissue in the direction of the hair in between each pencil. Once I've built up all 3 pencils, I can then think about using a putty eraser and an electric eraser to both add the lighter hairs back in and add in some of the little baby hairs. And then from there, I can add the baby hairs around the edge and any final adjustments. Alright, I hope you found this video helpful. Don't forget, if you do want to do the full tutorial, it is available on my Patreon. As always, happy drawing guys, and I'll see you in the next one.